Chapter 1. Ides of March, 1984. Wind and sleet raged against the little northwestern corner of Salt Lake County called Magna. A blinking yellow traffic light swung wildly, turning the sheets of sleet above it momentarily gold, then spotlighting the road underneath. And then it winked out. Across the street, as the sleet changed to a heavy snow, pieces of a billboard sign broke away and sailed east into vacant lots and fields. The Sinclair sign, with its glowing green dinosaur extinguished in the power outage, shook and rattled. Darkened storefronts and houses seemed to turn away from nature's angry abuse. In a window in the corner house, a red Victorian, a lighted candle was placed, a tiny, fragile glow, innocent against the tempest on the other side of the glass. Behind it, a girl. Some call her Nutty Nancy Nash. Pretty by any standards, but empty in her eyes, paced the floor and moaned as her exhausted mother, Sandy Nash, struggled to keep her from running out into the storm. Her stepfather, Paul Nash, a science teacher at Cypress High School, sat tiredly in an antique wooden chair and guarded the door. Nancy's brothers and sisters held vigil in the kitchen and made hot chocolate on the gas stove. Nancy waved her hands in the air, put a knuckle to her lips, squeezed her eyes shut, screeched, attacked the closest piece of furniture, then repeated the actions. Sandy tried to calm her, and for a moment felt hope. Nancy seemed to succumb to her mother's arms, but then fought away. Miles, her younger brother, both guarded the kitchen door and supervised the hot chocolate, but didn't look confident enough to stop his sister without hurting her should she decide to bolt through the kitchen. He also looked exhausted. This wasn't the first time Sandy had thought of institutionalizing her daughter. Each occasion brought sharp feelings of guilt and hopelessness and frustrating indecision, and then she would tell herself that maybe sometime in the future things would change. But then she would look at the neglect her other children suffered. Anger would set in, and she would imagine Nancy as some sort of black hole, sucking away all her motherly energy, dominating everyone else's lives and schedules. And sleep. Yet there was something more keeping her from giving up. Nancy had been there. Her bright, beautiful, dynamic, happy, fun little girl had been there, in her home, in her life, in her arms. Such a sweet, burning, intelligent personality. She wasn't completely gone, and Sandy knew it. Not long after Nancy's 13th birthday, she had become distant and moody. At first, Sandy attributed it to puberty. But when the strange outbursts and behavior problems began, not only at home but in school, she became worried. The specialists told her symptoms of autism rarely, if ever, showed up so suddenly or in an older child. Since they hadn't found evidence of a brain tumor, the most likely diagnosis was an obscure condition called CDD, or Childhood Disintegrative Disorder, also known as Heller's syndrome. Still, something wasn't right about the diagnosis. Her condition didn't completely match all the symptoms. Sometimes, if just briefly, she seemed almost there, scared and lost and pleading in her eyes. If it was simply a mother's hopeful imagination, it was still enough to keep taking her for tests, even out of state. The strangest symptom of all occurred every time they traveled more than 100 miles from home. She would become catatonic, as if completely surrendering to whatever held her captive. Her eyes would droop and become blank. She would lose all bodily control. Upon returning, she would re-energize and start to fight again. Financially drained, physically drained, and emotionally drained, Sandy raised her trembling hand, wanting to strike the hooting, arm-flapping, biting, scratching, smelly, stringy-haired animal child who should be cheerleading basketball games and choosing a dress for the freshman dance. Paul stood up from his chair and tenderly gripped her arm. "I'll take it from here," he said. Lightning momentarily turned his glasses into two white blanks. Sobbing, Nancy left the room. From the doorway she could see Nancy's dim form swaying hauntingly back and forth, her hands cupping her ears against the loud claps of thunder. Sandy sat on her bed, and hot tears stung her face. The bedroom window facing westward flashed with a terrible volley of lightning. She instinctively covered her head with her arms. At that same moment, Nancy screamed. Sandy screamed with her. On the west end of town, somewhere between Webster Elementary School to the north and the Pleasant Green Cemetery to the south, on a street with a great view of the Ochre foothills, Bogey Lewiston dreamed he was a famous movie star, performing the steamiest scene of his career. His co-star was the one and only Dana Plato from the TV show Different Strokes. And as the scene progressed, the Different Strokes theme song played, as if the movie itself were an extension of the television show. One moment he was kissing Dana's silky, innocent girl lips. The next he was kissing his new real-life girlfriend, Rachel Varney. But she still had Dana's lips. Just as things were getting good, his best friend, Jeff Addis, walked into the room to watch. Bogey tried to send him away, but he wouldn't move. So when Bogey's hand began to wander, Rachel Dana slapped it away, frustrating him. "But I love you," Bogey said. Rachel Dana's head turned. She looked him in the eyes, and her face changed to something terrible. Her slimy mouth, full of dog teeth, opened, and she took a long, deep breath and howled loudly in his face. He screamed and turned to Jeff, whose face had also turned elongated and dog-like, and he also began to howl. The intensity of sound became large and threatening, as if the air around them were a rushing river. He grabbed a knife, and without another thought plunged it into the Rachel Dana creature, whose jaw snapped and bit at his face. He thrust the knife again and again, feeling the skin and tissue break and the warm blood pour over his hand. When he looked again, it was just Rachel, gasping and dying in his arms. He woke up, swimming in horror and sound. He fell out of bed. Pain in his shoulder brought him into reality. Rain and sleet thrashed his windows, and behind the noise he heard his dogs howl and whine and scratch at the downstairs door. Stumbling around in the dark, for the power was out, he made it to the kitchen. Lightning revealed the black silhouette of his father slumped in a chair at a table covered by gleaming empty bottles. Bogey passed him in disgust at the smell of urine mixed with alcohol. The dogs barked and whined in a chorus. When he put his hand on the doorknob, his dad growled, "Well, aren't you going to let him in?" "Sure, Dad." The unlocked door, caught instantly by the wind, swung open and slammed against the side of the house. Sleet blasted in with 3 large, happy, wet dogs. They pattered across the kitchen floor, and one after another shook off water. Dad's voice issued from the darkness. "You kids want dogs, but won't take care of them." Ignoring him, Bogey remembered he'd left the dog bowl outside, so he found a dusty wooden salad bowl that hadn't been used since his mom ran off with a trucker, a guy Dad used to work with at Kennecott, and poured the dog some food. Lightning struck close by with a startling simultaneous blast of thunder, revealing the side of Dad's grisly face. One yellow, rheumy eye glared at him, the kind of glare he knew to stay away from. Letting the dogs go about their business, he sneaked away and past the living room where his oldest brother, Junior, slept on the old hideaway bed with his girlfriend. The dogs would eventually wake them up, if the storm hadn't already, but he didn't care. Knowing his dad was home and pissed off drunk, he thought it better to take his little tape recorder and a few tapes and spend the rest of the night in his closet, which wasn't the best of places to hide if Dad really wanted to come after him. If it weren't storming, he'd just leave, just sneak out and wander the night until he found a safe, comfortable place to doze. The old people's tool shed with the faulty lock nearby always sufficed, but he often fantasized of Rachel letting him into her warm bedroom. He thought one of these nights he might actually get the guts to pay her a visit and knock on her window. Using a match as a torch, he chose Pyromania by Def Leppard, Blackout by Scorpions, and El Loco by ZZ Top. All tapes Carl, his next oldest brother, left behind when he went to jail for drugs. What he really wanted to hear was that new song, Legs, that had recently come out on the radio. He thought it was Easy Top, but wasn't sure. If it was, he would have to acquire the new album, which wouldn't take much effort if he was careful. Inside the closet, he felt the vibrations of the house. The flue for the furnace ran exposed up one corner, keeping things warm. He moved aside some boxes where the carpet was still clean, took a blanket with him, shoved a rolled-up sleeping bag against the other corner, and then went for the tape player. The old black Sony tape player, rectangular like a brick, something his parents had bought a decade before, was missing the rewind, forward wind, and play buttons. But by using a butter knife, he could press the little metal pieces that the plastic buttons had been attached to into place. Because rewinding was the hardest, he always let the tape run through to the end where it would automatically stop. Then he would play it on the other side, and just be patient for the next go-round when he could hear his favorite songs over again. But on the Def Leppard tape, nearly every song was a favorite song, so it didn't matter, unless there was one he felt he really needed to hear. He checked the batteries, slipped in the tape, closed the little door, carefully started it, then adjusted the sound so he could listen to it by laying his head on the speaker as if it were a pillow. The creak of the gears and moving parts added to the hiss of sound as the blank beginning of the tape rolled through the magnets. His dream was to get a ghetto blaster, a portable stereo big enough to announce to the world that his music ruled. His grandparents on his mom's side always sent money for Christmas, never presents. But he couldn't complain about cash. In the past, his parents had made him use it for school clothes, but lately Dad didn't seem to care. Bogey received a $100 bill, which Dad kept somewhere, so if a ghetto blaster cost $60, along with it he could easily afford 2 pairs of Levi's if he caught a sale at the mall, which were enough to satisfy Dad if he asked. There were other ways to get clothes if he needed them. The tape noise changed in quality, as if from far away. A note, probably a guitar effect, faded in like a harbinger, introducing a sad ringing of clear guitars. They made him feel mysterious and lonely. Joe Elliott's rough, nasally voice, not as whiny as Robert Plant's of Led Zeppelin, but fuller, groaned in with the lyrics of Foolin', pining about lady luck, love gone bad, and loneliness. But then the heavy emotion and heavy distortion kicked in, making Bogey want to play air guitar in the dark. Downstairs, Dad howled at the storm, and Bogey, ever cautious, raised his head to listen, in case Dad's voice came closer. Junior was probably up by now, and when Dad got that way, Junior often served him something strong enough to put him unconscious for the rest of the night. "It's a bitch kitty of a storm," Dad yelled. "Devil's gonna come, you know." Bogey stared into the darkness, swallowed in fear, and hated his dad. On the south end of town, in some cheap duplexes, Marge Eaton lit candles and incense, sipped coffee, looked over the boxes that still needed to be emptied, and, troubled, listened to the storm. Her house shook, and something in the swamp cooler on the roof rattled. Since she couldn't sleep, she dedicated herself to repotting a plant that had been damaged in the move. Fergie, her spider plant. Her copper and silver jewelry often tinkled as she worked. The moist soil felt good in her hands. She wanted to bury them in the pot along with the plant. Living sisters, rooted in the earth, free of human care or responsibility. Nature was happy. Humanity was a curse. She asked herself, are we evil or divine? Whatever we were, whether hairless apes or something else, we were the last to come. She imagined life would be happiest if she embraced the inner animal, left civilization, returned to the wild to have sex, scavenge for food, and then die early, before having to rot away senile in some geriatric prison for the poor. But it was the system that kept people from nature, held them hostage and unauthentic, unfulfilled. Capitalism was the great crime, raping the earth, building ever bigger and bigger, poisoning, devouring until it was on the edge of destroying itself and everything else in nuclear disaster. The image of Ronald Reagan's face drifted through her mind like a ghost, and she shuddered. When she was finished with Fergie, she turned out the light and let the power of the storm flow around and through her. She approached the window, remembering her mother's drunken voice muffled by a cigarette. "Don't stand by a window in a storm. You'll get struck by lightning." Whether that was true or not, she had to see the storm. Sheets of rain turning to sleet lashed the street, and naked trees whipped and bent in the wind. She wasn't accustomed to Utah's weather, but the storm felt unusual, extra powerful. The energy didn't make her feel like dancing in the rain, like most storms she'd experienced. It felt like an angry wake in an astral sea. Lightning split the eastern sky in two, and the glass simultaneously reflected the world outside and the room behind her, revealing a shadowy face that wasn't her own. The eyes dark, icy, and hateful. She spun around to see Chad, her son, her love child, standing in the doorway, staring at her, not with the hate she'd seen in the reflection, but with contempt. Then he turned away with sleepy disinterest. When he was a little boy, he would have stood by her to study the storm with innocent curiosity. That boy was gone. A deeper voice, impossible to ignore but quiet enough to dismiss as a night terror, asked, "So what had taken his place?" She felt the rotating universe above her press down like a giant thumb. Slowly the storm began to calm, but in a confusing way. The energies around her had risen to a peak instead of passing, almost as if she were in the very center, in the eye, so to speak. She looked at a cheap granite pyramid covered in Egyptian symbols she'd bought in a New Age store in California. On one side was the ubiquitous Eye of Horus. As much as she claimed ancient mystic knowledge, the eye seemed just as foreign as if she'd never understood it at all. Its golden reflection took on living qualities in her imagination, and she thought, as she stared into the depths of an otherworldly vision, something stared back, and she slammed her eyes shut in horror. Her hand trembled, which meant a message from beyond. Once again, Chad was in the doorway, glaring at her. She found a pencil, grabbed the closest thing she could find, which was a phone book, relaxed, let herself slip into the trance state that often reminded her of the onset of labor and childbirth, surrendered to the other forces that took hold of her hand, and began to write. The last thing she remembered was her own voice, far away, as if she weren't in the room at all. A terrible sound between singing and crying in agony, saying words she couldn't bear to hear. The power was still out when Donnie Fish woke up. A light snow kept the world outside gray. Listening to a distant moaning chainsaw, he remembered the dreams he'd had during the night. They'd left behind sensations of fear and regret, and he was glad they were only dreams, except for one, which had come apart from the others. It felt like a promise in the form of soft sunshine in a girl's hair, her hand in his, a smile and peace. The others were a confusion of righteous anger, as if he were leading a charge against an unjust world only he could change. But the harder he fought, the more it crumbled in his hands and blew away into desolation and tragedy. It played in disconnected scenes from the movie The Road Warrior. Dad had rented it over the weekend. They'd watched it together, eating homemade popcorn and drinking RC Cola. Donnie had seen himself in the dream as Mel Gibson's character Mad Max, but he'd sported a Fidel Castro bearded cigar. The town had burned, and his feet had splashed through pools of blood. Letting the dreams fade away, he rubbed a sore neck, caused by sleeping with his pillow over his head to muffle thunder and lightning. He sat up and looked through the sleet-spattered window, then let out a long breath in surprise. A giant limb, torn from the big elm that shaded the parking lot, lay snugly inside the crushed windshield and cab of his family's 1970-something Impala that the neighbors had not so affectionately dubbed the Bomber. Dad had the trunk open and was removing tools. Directly below Donnie's window, the cheap redwood privacy fence that guarded the greasy cement slab outside their kitchen sliding doors was also flattened under a pile of limbs. After finding a pair of socks that didn't stink, tube socks, one had green and yellow stripes on the top, the other had blue stripes. He put on his shoes, then went shivering down the stairs. For breakfast, Mom had set out peanut butter and jam. His little brother and sisters sat in their coats at the table, eating, while Mom, interestingly shaded by the fallen tree limb, stood at the sliding door and watched Dad. "I don't want to bust it again," Mom said, still facing the doors. Donnie was about to say he was glad he didn't have to be embarrassed riding around in a junky car anymore. The kids at school were already making fun of it. Then Grandma Judith spoke up from the shadows in the living room. "I'm sure I can scrape up something to help you get another car." "I don't want your money," Mom said. "You know that." Grandma didn't answer back. Donnie saw her tighten her lips and look away. The truth was, his parents didn't have the money for a car, nor would they have it in the near future. What sat under the fallen branch had come out of a want ad for $200. Dad's new day job, pushing tailings at Kennicott, took care of the rent. Mom's night job as a waitress at Francesco's bought the food. Whatever paid for things like telephone service and the occasional movie and VCR rentals obviously didn't make it into savings. Donnie wanted a paper route, but he was afraid they'd just have to move again. Grandma, pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders, walked into the strange light of the kitchen, gave Donnie a squeeze on the shoulder, then joined Mom at the sliding doors. "When are you going to let me help you, honey? You can't carry the weight of the world on your back forever," she said. Expecting an argument, Donnie tensed, but was surprised when his mother said with a soft voice, "I don't intend to, Mom." "At least let me get some nice family photos done before you leave again. If you don't want them, I'd like to have them. Kmart's having a special." Mom shook her head and let out a long breath. "We're not leaving." Grandma turned to her, unbelief in her eyes. "That's right," Mom said. She folded her arms tighter around herself. She seemed scared. "Denny's got a job with potential. I like mine. Maybe we can really get a house this time." Grandma carefully put an arm around Mom's shoulder. Mom didn't pull away. A minute or two of silence went by. Then Mom said quietly, "We're not running anymore." Donnie finished his sandwich. When he looked up again, Mom's head was resting on Grandma's shoulder, a scene he took in with a wave of odd feelings. He picked up his plate and went into the living room to sit where Grandma had been. Above his head was a framed print of an old painting Mom had picked up at a yard sale, a painting that had haunted him since he was little. A golden retriever looked as if it had just emerged from the soft autumn grass. His nose pointed straight at a pretty yellow-breasted meadowlark perched on an old cedar fence post, the barbed wire rusted and sagging. The two creatures stared at each other, their eyes terribly dark, full of secrets. It was their eyes that haunted him. Mom had named the painting Doggy and Meadowlark. Music from outside cracked the quiet moment. Dad, in a dorky hat with ear flaps, waved his arms over the branches and danced to "I'm a Believer" by the Monkees, something from the oldies station. The kids laughed. "At least the radio still works," he yelled. Donnie set his sandwich aside, leaned forward, and shoved his hands into his hair. Chapter 2, Friday, March 16th, 1984. Pen scratches, paper shifts, desk squeaks, sighs, whispers, and someone chewing gum all answered Ms. Delfini's question. Should Magna, Utah incorporate as a city? Donnie intently watched the edge of no return, where Tina Barnes' legs disappeared under the hem of her denim miniskirt. Finally, Jenny Stewart, the freshman class president of Brockbank Junior High, raised her hand. "Yes, Miss Stewart," Delfini said. Back straight, pencil-like, under a brush of permed blonde hair, Jenny cleared her throat and said, "I think so. We should be a city. The city of Magna. Though my dad says the name should reflect the true old heritage, Pleasant Green. He supports the name change, but yes, we should... Thank you, Miss Stewart. Is there anyone who opposes the incorporation of Magna? More chewing gum. It was the large-boned girl who sat behind Donnie. She was nice, but not attractive. Anyone at all? Delphine twirled her hands, as if stirring the air would bring about answers. What do you think would happen to the tax base without Kennicott or Hercules to help foot the bill for basic government services? Are there enough businesses to help meet the cost of police and fire? How about snowplows and road maintenance and sidewalks and traffic lights? Jenny spoke up again. My dad says the county is the problem for our lack of business. If we were free to make our own rules, we could make changes in the government that would be business-friendly and... Thank you, Miss Stewart. Let's give others a chance to respond, shall we? And please, raise your hand next time. Someone in the back of the room snickered. Red-faced, Jenny looked at her notebook. Donnie felt sorry for her, until Tina moved her legs. He figured out how to put his head down on his desk and peek through a space where his arms were folded. No one would notice him staring, and he could enjoy the class period in the way he thought it should be enjoyed. I disagree, Chantal DeMint said. She sat near the front of the room with the new wave and punk crowd. At the beginning of the school year, she'd tried to copy Cyndi Lauper's weird style, but then cut her hair extremely short, which gave her a masculine look. Donnie hated her moi-moi voice, a term he felt witty enough to have conjured up himself when he was new in the class. Apparently there were others who might have hated it too. The subtle tone of noises changed. The girl behind him gave her gum a little pop. It's not fair that the big corporations can just opt out of paying their fair share of taxes, Chantal continued. Magna should stay a part of the county. People here are mostly poor and can't afford a raise in their property taxes. We should focus on Magna Main Street redevelopment, which the county will help with. That will revitalize the Main Street town center. Donnie heard Jenny mumble, It hasn't been the town center since before we were born. Chantal continued, Besides, staying a part of the larger county makes things more equal for everyone. Ooh, big words, someone with a deep bass voice whispered. Donnie snickered before he could help himself, causing others to join in. Well said, Chantal. Delphine turned to the rest. Can we show some respect in this room? Donnie glanced up to see if she was looking at him. Haloed by a poster of Cesar Chavez, she put her hands on her hips and severely looked over the class. He put his head back down. Any more comments? Slightly raising his head, Donnie couldn't help but glance at Jenny, who still stared at her notebook. All right, let's move on to world events, Delphine said. What's happening in Central America? Customary classroom background noise, paper shifts, and chewing gum static. Delphine unrolled a large old map of Central America, one that, unless she tied it to something, would spin and roll back up. Every time she used it, she grumbled about the lack of government spending on education. Please, someone tell me where El Salvador is, she said tiredly. There has to be someone in this room who can point it out. Because you're my little geniuses, right? Brad Anderson, Mr. Basketball, raised his hand. Donnie noticed Tina perk up. Brad stared at the map. Like, right there by Honduras and Nicaragua? Bonus for the boy with the bloated brown basketball. Dude, Brad's friend sent him a high five. So, why is El Salvador important in the news? Delphine asked. Chantal quickly raised her hand. Yes, sweetie, Delphine smiled. There's a civil war and Reagan's interfering? Exactly, Delphine said. They're like freedom fighters against the dictator government. I think they're the NFL or something like that. Laughs from the Brad side of the room. The gum-popping girl behind Donnie snickered. Close, Delphine said. You mean the FMLN, Farabundo Martí Nacional Liberación Front. Say that 5 times fast. The kid with the bass voice unsuccessfully tried just that, winning a broader round of laughs and sending the class into mild chaos. Jenny had her hand up again, but Delphine didn't seem to notice. Okay, everyone, let's calm it down a little. Delphine shifted to stand in front of a poster of bright primary colors with giant bubble letters over a peace sign, spelling the word love. You said Reagan's interfering. What do you think about that? She asked Chantal. I think it's totally undemocratic. I think he's going to turn Central America into another Vietnam. He's trying to stop an oppressed people from throwing off their tin pot dictators supported by Republicans. That's very insightful. Kudos to Chantel. Ms. Delphini? It was the chewing gum girl. And Kendra, what do you have to add to this stimulating discussion? I think Jenny's had her hand up a long time. For a moment, Delphini's face became an unreadable mask. Kendra, so that was her name, subtly popped her gum again. Jenny, Delphini said, her smile widening, but cooling. Please share your thoughts with us. Jenny dropped her arm as if relieved. I disagree. El Salvador is under the threat of being overthrown by communists like Nicaragua had. In fact, the terrorists are hiding in Honduras and being aided mainly by Cuba, the Sandinistas, and the Soviet Union. They have to be stopped before another country falls. It's a threat to the U.S. Okay, please share with us your evidence. It's a fact. So the Salvadoran government isn't an oligarchy with little regard for civil rights? A military dictatorship? There aren't death squads terrorizing people who oppose it? The people aren't suffering crushing poverty and inequality? I didn't say that. What I'm saying is, please, I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from. They're not freedom fighters. They're communist revolutionaries. They'll just bring in a different sort of dictatorship, a pro-Soviet one. So it's okay for the people to live under a dictatorship as long as it's not pro-Soviet, or rather progressive? Let's use the term progressive. They want to bring social progress and equality to their country. What's wrong with that? But they won't. Please, I beg of you once again, please share with us your evidence for that argument. My dad's in the military. He knows people. He also talks to a lot of people in his business. He explained to me how Cuba and Nicaragua are exporting their communist revolutions and how the Nicaraguan government sends aid to the terrorists. Let's not use that word, terrorist. I prefer freedom fighter. After all, if we were to argue about who is a terrorist and who isn't, we could make a good case that the American founding fathers would fall into that category. I always say one people's terrorist is another people's freedom fighter. But what a shame. We're out of time. Everyone, please let me have your attention. Your assignment is to go look up stories in the paper about the crisis in Central America. Both our school library and the public library have current and older editions you can look through. The public library has the New York Times, which I prefer above the Deseret News. The last two words she said with a subtle sneer. Then write 3 paragraphs explaining what you understand about the problems there, mainly in El Salvador and Nicaragua. The 3rd paragraph should give ideas on what America should do about these problems. The bell rang over her voice. I'll also accept feedback from articles you might read in publications like The New Republic and Mother Jones, because you're my brilliant little dearies. Donnie took an extra 10 seconds to watch Tina shift in her seat before he sat up and stretched, as if he'd been asleep. A subtle movement of air brought her perfume his way, and he felt as if he would spontaneously combust if she didn't at least notice him, send him a little smile or something. But she didn't. She picked up her books and joined a couple of girls heading to the front of the row. On his way out the door, he caught his reflection in the window and wished he could cover his face. His Levi jacket cuff had left a large imprint from his forehead to his cheek. A slow flow of high school students clogged the hall. Almost like aliens, they'd invaded the junior high school after the school district had torn down the old Cypress High School building, named in honor of the ancient copper mines on the Cypress Island in the Mediterranean Sea, an homage in connection to the modern Utah copper industry. The school had literally sunk with the falling water table. Stories floated about cracks appearing in walls and doors stuck so solidly in their frames the custodian had to pry them open with a crowbar. And since their mascot was the pirate, the joke was the pirate ship had sunk. So the other joke was that the students and staff, Delphini being one of them, who had come over from their classes while their new building was being built, were the survivors, and Brockbank Junior High was the rescue boat. When Donnie reached his locker, someone had the one next to his wide open so that the door blocked Donnie's access. It had been vacant up until then. Donnie figured the owner must have been a new kid. He was tall and could have passed for a high school student, but the high school students all had their lockers somewhere on the Cypress campus, just not in the building under construction. "Pardon me," Donnie said in a polite voice and moved the door slightly. As he reached for his combination lock, the kid slammed the door back open, hitting Donnie's hand. "Dude!" Donnie yelled. Seeming to ignore Donnie, the kid grabbed his jacket, lifted out a book, paused as if to think about his selection, then shoved the book back in. "Hey, can I get to my locker?" Donnie asked, fighting to stay polite. Most kids at the school seemed to follow an unwritten rule that one person should open a locker door just enough to get in, but not enough to block the other person. When he was about to reach for the door again, the kid slammed his locker shut and turned away as if nothing had happened. "Jerk," Donnie said under his breath. The kid disappeared into the crowd and Donnie felt cold. He decided to go the opposite direction. Once outside, he took a breath and decided to forget about the stupid tall kid. His feet scrunched through melting snow. Beyond the fence that lined the school property was a trail through an alfalfa field that led to the 7-Eleven. It was muddy, so he stayed along the edge. While he walked, sensations of the dreams he'd been having floated through him like smoke from a distant fire. He remembered touching a girl's hand, the one image that had stuck with him. The breeze felt colder, and he lifted up his collar. Once inside the 7-Eleven, he eyed the nachos. Someone had left the bin open, so he sneaked a chip and wondered where the couple of dollars in his pocket would go the farthest. Nachos? Soda pop? Slurpee? Candy cigarettes? A chocolate donut? Or video games? He chose the nachos and video games. Occasionally glancing at the doors as if the tall kid would come in after him, he poured hot cheese sauce from the dipper, carefully spreading it so he would have a place to pick up the chips, but then thought it would have been easier to fill the paper tray with cheese first, then put in the chips. The trick was to jam as many in as possible. After that, he opted for a cola for 2 fewer video games. Several kids had gathered around Centipede, leaving Dig Dug open. He walked to Dig Dug, ate a nacho, chased it with Coke, savored it, then put in a quarter. He studied the high scores for initials he might have known. Then the happy electronic music started. His little white and blue character tunneled through different layers of progressively darker shades of orange, pumping little floating balloon-like creatures until they burst into a gory mess. A thoroughly addicting game. Donnie was on the 6th level when a kid next to him said, "Dude, those nachos smell good." Donnie briefly glanced at his food, but couldn't take his attention away from the ghostly floating eyes that chased his little character across the board. A very pretty girl slapped the boy on the shoulder and said, "Bogey, don't be rude." "What, can't I ask for a nacho?" "You're being embarrassing." Donnie waited for the brief moment when he graduated to a new level, then picked up his chips and offered them to the kid, who looked surprised. "Dude, thanks, man." He took a few, lifting them in salute. "You're such a retard," the girl said to the kid. Another boy who was playing Centipede seemed to eye the nachos through a mop of long hair. Donnie offered him some, too. He took one without looking away from the game. Donnie then offered some to the girl and smiled. "No thanks," she said, but smiled back. With 1 quarter left, Donnie stepped away from Dig Dug and waited for a turn at Centipede. This time the kid the girl referred to as Bogey was playing. The girl put her arm around Bogey and rested her head on his shoulder. Donnie felt a mixture of longing and jealousy. He wondered how guys got girlfriends like that. In the background, "Too Much Time on My Hands" by Styx escaped from a transistor radio sitting on the counter. Donnie worked on his nachos until he was full. Half the nachos still remained, so he offered them to the kid with long hair, who smiled slightly and took a couple more. Bogey vigorously moved the trackball on the game, shooting his character from one side of the screen to the other, blasting the Centipede, which divided into independent segments, each segment turning into a mushroom. Donnie learned a new trick as he watched Bogey position his character in a spot where, if he kept shooting, he could create a tunnel of mushrooms. Shrooms, he called them, that the Centipede would follow down to its demise. But then a spider came from nowhere and wiped out his character. Bogey punched the machine as it bleeped out a sound of failure. "Dude, that sucks," Donnie said, and offered Bogey some chips. "You want the rest of them? I'm full." "Sure," Bogey said, taking the tray. "Aren't you, like, in Brockbank? I think I've seen you there." "Yeah," Donnie said. He took a drink of Coke. "So you guys live around here?" Round and round, Bogey said. Donnie noticed his sandy blonde hair, the way he had it parted in the middle and feathered back. He seemed tough, but not bad. I'm Rachel, the girl said. Footloose seeped from her headphones that hung around her neck like a collar. This is Jeff, she said, pointing to the kid with long hair. A little smile might have ticked at the edge of his lips. Let's give the man some room, Bogey said, and motioned with his hand toward the video game. The trio parted to let Donnie through. He set his Coke on the floor, put in a quarter, and pressed the start button. He felt the girl looking at him and became self-conscious. His movements weren't as quick as he wanted them to be. When he tried the tunnel trick he'd seen Bogey do, the spider came out of nowhere and killed his character also. I hate the spider, Bogey said, and gave Donnie a pat on the shoulder. Jeff clasped his hands behind his back and raised an eyebrow, reminiscent of Spock from Star Trek. We got a blow, Bogey said. Thanks for the grub, dude. Nice to meet you, Rachel said, smiling. Bogey pulled her close, protectively under his arm. As they turned to leave, he paused thoughtfully, then raised a finger. In a red skeleton lisp, he said, Confucius Thay, go to bed with itchy butt, wake up stinky finger. Donnie laughed and watched them go out the door. But his focus drifted over their heads to the Sinclair station. Someone, who he thought looked an awful lot like the tall kid from the locker incident, stood leaning against the cinder-block wall by the restrooms and smoking a cigarette. Donnie slipped out the door behind his new friends, followed them a few yards, then, after a brief so long, went the other direction past the hardware store and toward the field. When he looked back at the Sinclair station, the tall kid was gone. A feeling of loneliness slowed him down. The sun had almost fallen behind the tips of the Ochre Mountains, the edge of it still throwing its glass and silver rays, briefly blinding Donnie as he stared at its beauty. The northernmost peak, from his perspective smaller than the others, caught his attention. A desire to walk that direction began to grow. The feeling turned into curiosity, as if he suspected something special was out there. Then the sun's rays died away, leaving behind a hazy glow. He shoved his cold hands deep into his pockets and headed home instead. Chapter 3, Saturday, March 17th, 1984. Judith Hardman raised her cup of postum and let it warm in her hands. I'll always associate this drink with the war. That's when I stopped drinking coffee. Remember when coffee was hard to get? I remember it being worse in the Depression, Charles Chapbreeze said. But I was never a coffee drinker, so I really didn't notice. Ruth, his wife, smacked him on the arm. Stop your fibbing. You drank it when we met. It was only after you started going to church you quit. Even after, you'd sneak it now and then. I don't recall that, Chap said with a grin. You think I didn't notice it when you wanted to kiss, you old fool? Judith's attention shifted to the kitchen. Oh, you shouldn't have. Cheryl Wallace, their host, entered the living room. Coffee cake is ready. She carried a glass cake pan with oven mitts. It's right out of the oven, so be careful. Now tell me, Chap said. If this is coffee cake, then are we breaking the word of wisdom? I'm just asking. Oh, be quiet, Ruth said. Morning light shone through the windows, striking the large bookshelves that lined the walls. Judith noticed how between sets of neatly arranged books, many of them on Orrin Porter Rockwell and other colorful characters of the Old West, displays of crystals sparkled, and fossils seemed to come to life. She felt a chill and thought of Cheryl's husband, Walter, who'd recently passed away. The others in the room seemed to sense the feeling and became more sober as Cheryl passed out plates of cake. It's just us now, Cheryl said. She sat back with her own plate, then took a sip of her drink. You'd have thought knowing what we knew and doing what we did would have made us immortal. Ruth smiled. She reached over and put a hand on Cheryl's arm. So what news do you have for us? Chap asked, turning to Judith. Fighting a mixture of fear and excitement, she said, My daughter says she and Dennis are staying for good. They're not running anymore. Cheryl held her fork above her plate as if she'd suddenly turned into a statue. Ruth lost her smile and swallowed. Chap grunted, nodded his head, then put down his cup. He spoke. I have Gordy Rushton on the West Ogre Council with me now. I just have to get him with your grandson. Donnie, is it? Before someone else does, that is. That ought to be easy. Wasn't Gordy a comrade of your daughter and her husband? Ruth asked. Stephanie doesn't know, Judith said. She doesn't know about me. She motioned to the others in the room with her hand. She doesn't know about us. Gordy's the only one from their group to know so far, and that's pure synchronicity. Stephanie's fought hard to avoid anyone she's associated with. I'm terrified what she'd do if I told her everything. She might leave forever. Not a chance, Ruth said. They're all coming back. They could never really leave. It draws them. What we risk is a big reunion without us here to make sure things go right. There are others, Chap said. Not friendly. You could pass them on the street and not know it. DeMint campaigned fiercely to bring into the council a young woman I'd never seen before. I should have expected there was more going on than her corrupt cronyism. If it wasn't for Gordy, I never would have known who she was. She teaches at the junior high school during the day. It's no accident she's there, and with your grandson at the same school. Judith's face hardened. Then why don't we do something now? This is too big for us. We've lost track of all the pieces, and things are just beginning to fall together. It was arrogance, Cheryl said. She sadly shook her head. We thought we were the shining ones. We had no one to guide us, Ruth said. We have to step forward now, as we should have long ago. Maybe this time things will be different. For the grandchildren, anyway. Maybe, Chap said. To Donnie, that Saturday morning felt just like a spring morning should feel. Snow continued to melt, leaving black puddles in the Safeway parking lot. Though his little sisters wanted to stop at the machines that dispersed candy, peanuts, and little toys in plastic eggs, Mom herded them through the door to the shopping carts. Donnie yanked one out of the long row, causing a metal clatter. His little brother, Corey, went to go look at the magazines. When Donnie started to follow him, Mom said, Stay with me. I need your help. Knowing it was useless to argue, he pinched his lips together and sulked to the produce section. Beyond the large glass windows, the supermarket interior felt shadowy. In the cereal aisle, he stared at dirty floor tile and thought of the thousands of shoes and shopping cart wheels that had passed through there. His two little sisters started fighting over whether to get the Boo Berry or to get the Count Chocula, but Mom held a box of Kicks and let out a sad breath when she looked at the price. Spiritless shopping music played over an intercom system, punctuated at times by calls to employees. Donnie, could you get me 2 loaves of bread? Mom asked. Huh? Oh, yeah, he turned to go. Please make sure you get the cheapest. Someone's voice whispered down the aisle behind him. Stephanie? My gosh, is that you? I didn't know you were back in town. Donnie turned and saw a woman holding onto a shopping cart with one hand and a girl about Donnie's age with the other. She had stopped by the Quaker Oats and nearly bumped carts with Mom. Sandy, Mom said in the same tone of voice and reserve, as if they were glad to see each other but didn't want the rest of the world to know it. Mom put her hand on the lady's arm and glanced around. Secretive, Donnie thought, but that's what he was used to about his parents. The girl hid behind her mother and played with her bottom lip. She stared in the direction of the shredded wheat but didn't seem to look at anything at all. She rocked gently back and forth. Her hair was bland and unstyled. No makeup. A retard, Donnie thought. Pretty, but still a retard. Is that Nancy? Mom asked. Sandy paused as if unsure what to say. She's had a lot of problems. I'm sorry to hear that. Donnie could see the conversation didn't include him, though Sandy had glanced in his direction. He walked away, thinking of bread and the possibility of getting away from his brothers and sisters and wandering through town, maybe heading west to the foothills. He turned his attention to a different girl, blonde, high school age, who stood at a nearby till, waiting for a customer to come along. She didn't seem to notice him. When he found some loaves for 49 cents each, he thought, that ought to make Mom happy. Donnie raised his head. The retard girl stood alone in the middle of his aisle. Some other look had replaced the emptiness he'd seen in her face. Her head tipped slightly forward and her arms dangled loosely at her sides. Ape girl, he thought, and found himself slowly backing away. Her eyes suddenly focused and followed him, and he thought he saw her smile, which gave him the creeps. Some of the kids in the neighborhood talked about her. Nutty Nancy Nash. She was the butt of dirty jokes, probably because some couldn't reconcile a pretty girl like her being feeble-headed. If a guy lost a game or something, he got a free ticket to go hump Nutty Nancy. Others didn't take too kindly to that talk and ridiculed the ridiculer. He was about to turn the corner when he felt a strong grip on his shirt, which made little pops in the seams. He turned, surprised. Nancy let out a small hoot and pulled. His first thought was to clobber her with a loaf of bread, but he didn't. Instead, he reacted by gently putting his hand over hers. Her fingers tightened, and she yanked, forcing him to grab her wrist. "Nancy!" Sandy called down the aisle. "Nancy, honey, let's go." Nancy's eyes seemed to tell him something, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. A babbling noise came out of her mouth. "Honey, let's go," Sandy said, as if talking to a toddler. She slapped Nancy on the hand. Nancy whined and grunted, then gripped Donnie in a big bear hug. He put his hands on her waist and pushed. That wasn't enough. Her slobbery mouth pressed against his cheek. The scene had caught the attention of other shoppers and the blonde checker. Her mother tried to free him. The harder she pulled, the tighter Nancy's grip became. Donnie felt his face turn red. "Stop it, Nancy! Stop it this instant!" His instincts made him want to fight her, but something else, almost like an inner voice, told him differently. "Wait," he said. "Wait, stop." Sandy stepped away with a panicked look on her face and momentarily wove her fingers into her own hair, looking around at the turned heads and staring faces. He put his arms around Nancy and said, "Hey, it's okay. I'm your friend. I'm Donnie." She let out a sound of excitement that sirened from a high pitch to a low growl. She bounced up and down and loosened her arms. Donnie gently pried himself free. "I'm so sorry," Sandy said, taking Nancy and slowly moving to the door. "This is so embarrassing." "It's okay," Donnie said, wiping the slobber off his face with his stretched shirt. Grunting, Nancy leaned one way, then the other, nearly pulling Sandy over with her. "Bye, Nancy," Donnie said. She abruptly stopped and turned her head. For a few seconds, Donnie saw that look again in her eyes, as if she had something to say. Then she left willingly and docilely with Sandy. Mom stood speechless at the opening of the aisle, holding the cart. The older of his little sisters was upset. People returned to their business as if nothing had happened. "She can't help it. She doesn't know better," Mom said. "I know," Donnie said. "Can't we just get out of here?" Mom started moving toward the checkout counter. Donnie looked at the blonde girl. "I'll wait outside." "Don't go anywhere. I still need help with the groceries and your brother and sisters." He knew what she meant, which was something just as embarrassing as getting loved on by a retard. Mom planned on pushing the shopping cart all the way up the road to the apartments, something he thought only vagrants did. Without a car, his family was reduced to being shopping cart people.